Could ADD be a superpower? It turns out that a lot of people who did terrible in school, in high school, college, and beforehand, end up excelling in the real world. Why is that? A few years ago, Malcolm Gladwell put out a book called David and Goliath, where he cataloged CEO after CEO and creative professional after creative professional who had been diagnosed with ADD and actually had a pretty poor start in life, by anyone who was projecting how successful a certain person would be. And yet these people have risen time and again to the top of their field. There's also this guy named Peter Shankman, who is a serial entrepreneur and has this weekly newsletter about how ADD constantly has allowed him not only to start business after successful business, but also teach him how important it is to sometimes fail at the things that he's trying. And he says that this sort of like mental thing that those of us who have ADD have ends up really being advantageous when you're somebody who lives in a world where you have to take risks. And this is very, very important. And that risk-taking, that failure that so many people like me who have ADD experience throughout, honestly, a lot of our lives is maybe the reason why ADD is actually correlates with so much success, why it's a superpower. Now, my report cards in high school were hilariously bad. And in middle school and elementary school, they were even worse. I was the sort of kid who teachers would go to those parent-teacher conferences and say, Scott has a lot of potential. He's got a lot of ideas, but he's not somebody who can follow through. This was always code for Scott is not doing very well. It is cause for concern. I had a lot of trouble reading. In fact, I still read incredibly slow. I'm the sort of person who will look at a page and want to sort of flit around to different parts on the page just to see if there's anything cool happening elsewhere. It's sort of like the FOMO of the reading world, which also meant that I flunked a lot of courses. If I got a C, I was psyched. And just about every report card had an F on it. But there were a few exceptions. I had a couple teachers, one woman named Mrs. Wheeler who taught me biology, and another woman, Catherine Reed, who taught me English in high school, who really, really honed in on sort of my, own mental insanity and played to the sort of love that I have and played to my curiosity. And that was really much more effective than other courses, such as how math is typically taught, where they give you an equation, like the quadratic equation or whatever, and you fill in certain variables and then you pop out an answer. And if you're just really good at following instructions, it's very, very easy to excel at that. However, I'm the sort of guy who wanted to know why. Why is the quadratic equation so quadratic, or whatever? I wanted to dig in and get more information than what was being presented. That does not correlate super well with the objectives of the American educational paradigm. Then in 7th grade, I got diagnosed with ADD. I took this test called the Wechsler, which looks at sort of spatial orientation, time management, and sort of task adherence. And it came out that, this guy, he is ADD and maybe just a little bit dyslexic too. And at the time, Ritalin, which is basically a light amphetamine, was showing up as sort of a miracle drug for people with ADD. And my father, who was a doctor, said, oh man, we just have to put the stuff in the milk. It's going to be great. But I was always very suspicious. I was like, look, I don't want to mess with my brain. I don't want to change whatever's going on in there. And also this was at the time of DARE, so just say no to drugs, boys and girls. And I wouldn't do it. I just would refuse to take the drugs. And that ended up weirdly being beneficial, because maybe taking it would have actually helped me adhere to the protocols of the time, but it wouldn't have translated into the management routines that I sort of learned later. One of the things that's so important about ADD and the experience of having ADD is that when you're in these institutions that are telling you what to do and how to think, you fail. I mean, you fail all the time. Things that should be easy end up being hard, and then people tell you you're being bad or dumb or whatever else. And you at first that hurts a lot, but then you sort of come to expect it and you become inured to failure. My parents were disappointed in me sometimes. I mean, they weren't mean to me. My parents are great, but they don't want their kids to always be like getting F's. And but over time, it didn't faze me as much. I sort of said, sometimes I'm going to do good at things, sometimes I'm not. And I sort of like played to the good news, right? When I would get good news, when there was something that I really liked, and those like small achievements that I worked so hard to get, those actually played more to me than the failure that I expected all along. And one of the things that always has really, really gotten me are deadlines. And this is probably why tests were so terrible for me, is that, you're sitting down and there's like, you have an hour to answer these 20 questions or 50 questions or whatever it is. And because I knew that there was going to be a point where the teacher said, put your pencils down and get out of that room, I never wanted to be that kid who didn't finish, right? So I would rush through all of the tests that I did, scared of that time when they said that you have to be done. So, I mean, this is a weird psychological thing probably with my own brain, but as I sort of rushed and did badly on the test, it obviously was very, very counterproductive. I would often get not very good grades. But at the same time, the strategy for taking tests, you don't take tests in life. What you do in life is actually do things, do accomplishments. And that actual fear of the deadline ended up manifesting in a really positive way later in my life, because what I did is with bigger projects, with things that had like a hard deadline, say like a college term paper, like a 20-page paper or a 50-page paper or whatever, I would actually read the syllabus and be like, oh my God, in 4 weeks, I'm gonna have a paper. And so then what I would do is I would plan and, work my ass off and get that paper done always at least a week before, it was actually due. And what this allowed me to do is like, segment my time and plan ahead for what was eventually coming. Now, my work was maybe not necessarily better, but that time management skill was critical. While some people are really driven by deadlines, there's the classic all-nighter that people do in college. Those deadlines for me are paralyzing. So I defeated it by actually using that same strategy I did in math tests in high school, which is that I just worked in advance, but I worked also carefully because I had more time to strategize. Now, in college, I wouldn't say that my papers were at all brilliant, but now what this translates into is that I can look at a really, really big project, such as a book or like a movie or, whatever it is that I'm working on. And I can plan out up to 5 years in the future now. I'll be like, well, what will I be doing in 2027? Okay. And if I put 2027 on my calendar and like, I want to have a manuscript done or 4 manuscripts done or whatever, then I'm able to compartmentalize that work and break it up into little parts, and I get there. And I wouldn't have mastered this skill if ADD had not like pushed me into that, had it not like forced me, if I wasn't so terrified of coming up against that deadline. And I've turned that to my advantage. I mean, at this point, I've written 5 books, 5 big books. I mean, some of them are bigger than others, but they're all good. So with this sort of weird organization, I sort of look at it in sort of military terms, right? There's strategy, which is the grand plan for running a war, and then there's tactics where you're actually, fighting the battle. Well, ADD means that my tactics are terrible. Like in the battle, I'm going to be scattershot. I'm going to be all over the place, shooting into the air, at my topics. But my strategies are actually very, very good. I can plan out things over a long period of time. And I wouldn't have learned that if I wasn't so damn distractible. Sometimes the way I think about it, it's like procrastination via planning. Like some people procrastinate as they get to the deadline, like, oh my God, I'm not going to get this thing done. But what I do is in order to slack off, I plan the hell out of my time. ADD taught me that. The other thing that I do, which is very common, is I start like a bunch of projects. Like I will, because ADD, attention deficit disorder, means that I can't focus on any one thing very well. I instead have like 6 different big projects going on at once, sort of like, 2 or 3 books. I have a podcast about these other things, this YouTube series, whatever. I've got like tons of things firing at once. And because I can plan them out, I expect, a lot of the stuff that I do, I expect it to fail. By being able to have all that stuff going, even if 2, 3, or 4 of those things drop out, I still have other things to push on. And that has been a very resilient strategy in everything that I do. So at least in my case, and all of the cases that Malcolm Gladwell and Peter Shankman have talked about, ADD, it's my superpower. And one thing that I'd really like to say is that if you have a kid who's struggling in school, maybe they're diagnosed with ADD, realize that it's not the end of the world. I mean, yes, give them as much support as they can take, but realize that what you do in high school doesn't necessarily track with what you might be doing later. Like, grades are just grades. Life is a whole nother thing. All right. Thank you. Please like and subscribe. Leave comments. It is really, really important for getting this channel discovered and people like hearing about the weird things that are going through my mind. Some of these things are interesting. Maybe some things are not. But thank you for listening and watching, and I'll see you next time.